Chapter 3. Despite stepping out of Ellie's house with a renewed sense of purpose, Hector was quickly reminded of the facts of their current situation. They had just had a nuclear bomb detonated in the middle of their city. Finding survivors wasn't going to be as easy as just walking into every building that was still standing somewhat and running into someone that could up and leave. Even the other handful of houses in the immediate vicinity of where he and Ellie had met were largely inaccessible. Furthermore, if anyone was alive inside of those wreckages, they didn't seem to be conscious or capable of calling out. Not that Hector and Ellie could have done anything to rescue them. They would have had to have left them behind. The few houses that the pair of them had been able to clamber into didn't go any differently. While all of them had the unmistakable signs of people living there, things like actually having furnishings, nobody was present when they looked within. "It makes sense when you think about it," Ellie had said after Hector voiced his frustrations. "At the time the bomb went off, most people would have been at work or at school, especially in a poor neighborhood like this where most people couldn't afford to stay at home." Hector had been forced to calm himself and admit that she was right, although he had wished she had pointed that out to him earlier. That left them with a problem. As far as Hector was aware, they were a lot more likely to find places of work or schools by moving towards the city center. However, moving towards the city center would mean moving closer to the detonation site. It was true that there were sturdier buildings that offered better protection that way, but didn't being closer to the point of the explosion reduce chances of survivability and increase the chances of them coming across some sort of hazard? What if one of those big, heavy buildings toppled over while they were in the area? That was one problem, but they had a more immediate one, too. Hector had been about to ask Ellie's thoughts on the matter when she suddenly dashed off to the side of the road they were heading down and doubled over to throw up again. This wasn't the first time since her house, either. The girl ended up heaving up globs of bile once or twice every 15 minutes or so. She was managing to walk on her own 2 feet at least, and in those moments of sickness displayed sudden, surprising bursts of speed. However, she still found her limbs turning to jelly on occasion and would need to cling to Hector for support. Hector was aware of his own increasing sense of nausea, too. He was definitely faring better than Ellie was, but every now and then he felt a wave of sickness that nearly had him rushing to the roadside as well. He wasn't sure if it was repeatedly hearing the awful heaving and retching noises produced by Ellie, or if it was something to do with all the noxious fumes and dirt still hanging in the air, but it didn't really matter. If he was going the same way she was, they were going to have a very real issue getting through the city, regardless of where they chose to go. "Sorry," Ellie said, hobbling back to him. "I'm slowing you down, and I think I might need to hold on to you again for a while." Hector sighed and shook his head. "I told you it's fine. I had a thought about that, though." Ellie turned to look up at him as she resumed the position of leaning against his side with an arm wrapped around him. "A thought?" "Yeah, I have those sometimes." Hector felt the change to her body's shuddering as she laughed at the remark. He was rapidly coming to find that making her laugh felt good. It made it easier to keep going. If we have to keep stopping for you to puke, we're not getting anywhere quick. Especially because every time it happens, it wrecks you so much that I have to help you walk. On top of that, I'm starting to feel pretty crappy too. I'm probably not far off of being where you are." Ellie opened her mouth to speak, probably to apologize again, but Hector cut her off. He didn't need to hear more apologies. He wanted to present his plan and get a response. "I don't think either of us are going to be much help to any other survivors we come across in this condition. So, I think we should stop looking for people for now. Instead, we should focus on ourselves and look for supplies. We're going to need water to keep our hydration up, especially yours right now. It would be nice if we could find some medicine to stop us feeling sick, too." Ellie thought for a little bit, but the reply Hector was hoping for came quite quickly. "I think you're right. I could definitely go for some of that hypothetical medicine right about now. You're pretty smart and level-headed, you know?" Hector almost choked on his heart as it fluttered up into his throat at that remark. He couldn't remember the last time that anyone had ever said he was clever or had an even temper. It left him with a warmth in his belly that he couldn't remember feeling at all in recent times. It was nice. It energized him. "I'm not that smart. I'm just being practical." Despite saying that, he couldn't help but smile giddily. He felt a little guilty for his happiness about a silly compliment in such dire times, when people he knew and loved were dead, but it was precisely because of the misery all around him that such a simple pleasure was so intoxicating. Although she didn't make much of a sound, Hector could feel the faint vibration of Ellie chuckling under her breath against him. He felt a flush of embarrassment, drawing the conclusion that Ellie had seen him grinning like an idiot. "Anyway," Hector said hastily, "I think we should keep checking neighborhoods like this one and start slowly moving outwards away from the city. We're more likely to find usable supplies in less damaged places. Any people further out will have had a better shot at surviving too, I suppose." "Makes sense to me," Ellie said. "Let's go." As it turned out, much like hunting for survivors, searching for supplies was much easier said than done. Even ignoring their own injuries and illness, the simple matter remained that a great many buildings had been damaged to the point of inaccessibility. They moved a little further out as best they could. Finding homes that weren't totally leveled was slightly easier here, but even then, there were plenty that they couldn't manage to get inside. To make matters still more frustrating, even the houses that they could get into weren't exactly rife with supplies to pilfer. Typically, the insides of each home were littered with debris and the remnants of broken furniture. They could try to pick through it all to potentially find something still intact enough to be useful, but that would have taken them hours, and there was no guarantee they would actually dig up something they could make use of. They were still in poorer neighborhoods, too, which by default meant that supplies were harder to come by, even in the less damaged buildings. Worse than the destroyed furnishings and collapsed walls, though, was the devastation of the parts of the house that were normally kept out of view. Many times they had climbed into a dwelling only for Ellie to point out wires hanging out of a roof or wall. If those weren't easily avoidable, they had to turn around and leave. They couldn't risk getting electrocuted. It wasn't like they could just call an ambulance and hope for the best if something went wrong. The other obstacle was ruined plumbing. More often than not, when the places they entered had been hit by the shockwave, pipes had been torn asunder and started flooding structures with water or sewage. Anything that had survived being destroyed by the blast had almost certainly been wrecked beyond recovery by water damage. Then there were the corpses. Ellie had been right. Most of the places they had entered had been empty. Every now and then, though, they stumbled upon a building with the remains of its last occupant still inside. The first time it happened, it had immediately triggered another one of Ellie's nauseous episodes, and Hector hadn't fared much better. They had found a man who'd been crushed in bed by his roof caving in. They left that house without even trying to salvage anything. Those houses were never pleasant, but after the initial shock, Hector and Ellie were getting desensitized to the dead alarmingly quickly. They simply avoided the rooms with bodies in as best as they could as they explored. Not that this was making their hunt any more fruitful. "I'm starting to rethink my idea," Hector grumbled as they climbed out an empty window frame. He had lost count of the number of houses they had tried at that point. He couldn't say how long they had been looking either, as the sky above them remained a persistent, uniform dark gray on account of smoke and ash. "Don't give up yet." Ellie climbed out behind him, panting heavily. She seemed to be having a harder time with the physical side of their explorations than Hector was, no doubt because of how sick she had been feeling. "Everything you said made sense. Let's try a few more before giving up." Hector couldn't justify giving in to himself. Not when Ellie was still determined to stick to his plan, and not when he could see her visibly suffering with each excursion. They really needed to find something that would settle her sickness at least a little. He wanted to do something about the burns on her hand, too. Besides, it wasn't like his logic had changed since he outlined their plan of attack. Things were only going to get harder if they couldn't find anything to treat Ellie with. Hector wasn't feeling particularly great himself, either. The next several houses they tried were just as wrecked and barren of useful supplies as the previous ones. It wasn't until the fourth one that they found a place that looked a little more promising. It was a bit bigger than the house Hector had found Ellie in, and in a similar state. Parts of it near the front and around one side had been caved in, but it was still standing for the most part. A missing window provided easy access to the interior. Hector was pleasantly surprised by what he saw. While there were still chunks of wood, brick, and glass littering the inside of the house, at a glance it already looked like it was in far better condition. "See?" Ellie wheezed. "This place looks promising. You should find somewhere you can sit down and rest for a bit while I look around." What? I should help you, Ellie protested. In truth, Hector would have appreciated the help and would have preferred not to search the house alone. He was worried about his companion's health, though. She had been retching a lot and not had anything to drink to get her fluids back up. If you're feeling okay after sitting for a few minutes, come and join me. I don't want you passing out on me while we work, though. Maybe there's still a couch or bed in one piece. I guess I'll take you up on that. As Ellie disappeared through the door, Hector properly took in his surroundings for the first time. It seemed they had climbed through into some sort of home office or study. An old computer monitor was laying on the ground, the glass of its screen having been blown out. Pages from a handful of books were scattered about. On closer inspection, the splinters of wood and shards of brick and plaster seemed to have largely been blasted in from somewhere else in the house. Hector wondered if there was any point in grabbing the loose book pages, but couldn't immediately think of what use they could have, so instead he pressed onwards. Found a surviving bed, Ellie called from further inside. See anything else useful laying around? Hector asked. Not really. I dig around their cupboards, but I was told I should rest. I'll take a look there in a bit. Hector continued to survey the building. He had stepped out into a small hall. The side leading to the front of the house was partially collapsed. The other way opened out into a kitchen, and beyond that a small dining space. Like the outside, the interior was also very similar to the home Ellie had been staying in. The biggest difference between them, other than what seemed like an extra room or two, was that the sheer amount of debris inside this home made it clear it had been much better furnished. Hector could barely ascertain the color of the floor underneath the piles of torn-off pieces of furniture and other wreckage. Broken glass, plaster, and brick had been stripped from the walls and ceiling during the blast. Every step he made was accompanied by the sounds of things crunching and cracking underfoot. Dust hung around like a veil. Entering the kitchen, Hector began to open the slatted wood pantry door. Unfortunately for him, something seemed to have happened to the door that was now preventing it from opening. Hector pulled at the door with all his strength, but failed to budge it even slightly. He tried wrenching the slats out too, but lacked the strength to pull them free. It would have been nice to have access to the supplies within, but he wasn't going to spend the rest of the day trying to figure out what to do about the busted door. He went to the fridge next and was pleased to find that it did, in fact, open. It was still holding some of its chill, but there was no light inside and no telltale humming to suggest that the power was still on. Either there was an outage in general or something had been damaged that cut this house off. Either way, he wasn't sure he was brave enough to take any of the cold meats he found his eyes drawn to. Instead, he grabbed a couple of bananas and the 2 bottles of water he found sitting within and placed them on the counter. It wasn't exactly ideal. The people who had lived there had apparently been just about due for a grocery day, but at the very least, they had some food and water. Hector moved on through the house, past the dining room and into the next hallway. The rooms in front of him had likely been bedrooms at one point, but now he couldn't even open the door to one room and the other had been reduced to rubble. Walking further down the hall, he eventually came to 3 open doors. The one directly ahead simply led into a powder room, so there was nothing useful there. To his right was a small bedroom that looked as though it had belonged to a young child. The walls were painted blue and dotted with unnaturally pink animals. Ellie was reclining on top of a bedspread sporting a cartoon princess that Hector couldn't identify. "Find anything good?" she asked. "Sort of," Hector replied. "I grabbed some bananas and bottles of water. It's not a lot, but we're not in any danger of starving or dying of thirst." "Better than nothing," Ellie said. "Good job. Are you sure you don't want any help with the rest?" "I'm okay. There's only one room left besides the one you're in. If you're feeling up to it, I suppose you can rummage around in here for a bag." "I think I can manage." Hector nodded and left her to it, turning his attention to the other door. It led into a small bathroom. Like the other rooms before it, the floor was covered with broken glass. The shower screen, window, and mirror had all exploded when the shockwave reached them. Luckily, though, it seemed like that was the worst of the damage the room had received. It wasn't flooded like had happened to so many of the other houses they'd been through. Hector walked in and opened the cupboards beneath the sink. He didn't see much point in looting the 3 toothbrushes he saw sitting in a pot under there, but he did pull out a handful of towels. He carefully pulled open the mirror to look into the medicine cabinet and was pleasantly surprised to find that it did actually contain medicine. He didn't really recognize most of it. It all had unfamiliar, scientific-sounding names. He was pretty sure some of it was for allergies or hay fever, but that wasn't going to do them much good. Looking through, though, he did see another box he recognized. His mom had snuck some back from work when he had been very ill once. As far as he remembered, he'd felt immeasurably better within about 30 minutes. "I hit the jackpot here," Hector said, picking up the box. Grabbing the towels under one arm, he walked back across into the child's bedroom to find Ellie sitting on the edge of the bed with what looked like a waterproof backpack. It looked kind of similar to the ones you'd sometimes see issued by schools. "Here," Hector chucked her the box. "Stick one of those in your mouth and let it dissolve. You should feel less sick in about half an hour. I think. It's been a while." "Thanks. Sorry," Ellie said. Hector looked at her baffled. "What are you apologizing for now?" "I don't know. This?" She waved the box at him. "You keep going out of your way to help me. I'm definitely slowing us down." Hector found his temper flaring again. This wasn't the first time she had apologized for no good reason. He couldn't understand why she seemed determined to shoulder some sort of blame. He shoved that instinctual flare of annoyance down, though. Getting mad wasn't going to make things any easier for either of them. "You really need to stop apologizing. You can't help feeling sick, and I'd much rather be doing this slightly slower with you than on my own. I don't know what your life was like before this happened, but surely it can't be that hard to believe that I don't mind helping you out when you need it. I want to." "I guess," Ellie replied, still looking downcast. "I just wish I was more help. You're really good at this survival stuff already, and I can barely do anything without throwing up." "Are you kidding?" Hector actually laughed. It was so surreal having someone talk to him like he was superior in some way. "You're way smarter than me. It didn't even occur to me that most people would have been at work or at school when the bomb went off. I was getting so frustrated when I couldn't find any other survivors, and it took you seconds to point out there probably weren't many people around to find." "That didn't change anything, though." "It kept me calm. You're good at that. This whole time, every time you laugh at one of my dumb jokes or say something witty, hell, every time you just put that little smile on for just a moment, it makes it easier to deal with all this. You're being more help than you can possibly imagine just by being here, so don't worry about the small stuff." A silence fell between them, and Hector felt the outward flare of anger he had forcibly suppressed suddenly pull in and morph into the twisting inward grasp of embarrassment. He had never really talked about his feelings so openly and plainly before, certainly not with a girl he'd only just met. He supposed it had something to do with their circumstances, but that didn't make him any less aware of the burning in his cheeks, and being aware of that sensation only made him feel more embarrassed and self-conscious. Blessedly, Ellie seemed too surprised by what he had said to notice. She was lost in thought for a moment before the now familiar, fleeting smile Hector had talked about graced her features. "Okay, I'll take your word for it." Hector pushed aside musings on whether or not she had made that face on purpose to focus on the practical again. "Okay, let's fill up that bag with our supplies. I'll go get the stuff from the kitchen." He tossed her the bundle of towels he'd been holding and headed out of the room, grabbing the bananas and water. He returned a short while later with the bananas and water he'd found and passed them to Ellie. "I don't know if you're ready to eat anything," Hector said, "but you should have some of the water at least." Ellie cracked open one of the plastic bottles and took a hesitant sip before stuffing the food and water into the bag on top of the towels. "Anything else we should bring?" "A blanket couldn't hurt, I guess," Hector replied. "I have no idea how long it will be until we find help. It's winter, though, and it must be at least mid-afternoon now. We might have to sleep somewhere without much in the way of heating at some point." In truth, the thought of just staying in the house had crossed Hector's mind. It was sheltered and safe, and if they could get the pantry open, they would likely have supplies. That wasn't the plan, though, and Hector was eager to find help from someone with a better grasp of the situation. They couldn't just sit around and hope someone found them. They had to keep moving. "Good idea." Ellie plopped the bag off the bed and onto the floor and stood up. She began to pull the princess-themed duvet from the top of the child's bed. "What are you doing?" Hector asked. "Getting a blanket," Ellie replied. The two looked at each other for a moment until Hector finally spoke up, feeling his self-consciousness growing. "I'm now trying to decide what's more embarrassing. Being embarrassed during a survival situation or carrying around a princess blanket." A sound halfway between a wheeze and a snort blew out of Ellie's nose as she covered her mouth with her hand. The damage was done, though, and she could not prevent herself from laughing loudly and joyously. The twinge of awkwardness was still there, but Hector couldn't help but find a stupid grin forming on his own face. There was something reassuring about Ellie's laughter. It was like he had just said to her. It made it seem like things really weren't as bad as they were. "Probably the latter," Ellie said, finally composing herself enough to reply. Despite that, though, and her continued smirking, she dropped the cover back on the bed and started going through the kids' cupboards and drawers instead. It wasn't long before she had found a pink fleece blanket about the same size as the duvet. "Is pink going to offend your manliness?" "Of course not," Hector said with mock offense. "Real men wear pink." Ellie looked him up and down and then chuckled lightly to herself as she placed the blanket in the bag over their other supplies. To say the least, it was a reminder to Hector that there was a distinct lack of pink in his wardrobe. "Okay," Ellie said. "Now what?" "I can't think of anything else we'll need immediately," Hector said. "Actually, wait. Dig out a sheet. I'll be right back." Hector dashed back out the room, returning to the kitchen once more. He started to go through the drawers. It didn't take long for him to find a suitably long, sharp knife and a pair of kitchen shears. He made his way back to the room to find Ellie pulling out a sheet that just about matched the color of the blanket they had already removed. "What are they for?" Ellie asked. "You never know when a knife might come in handy," Hector said. "Same for the scissors, I guess, but mostly they're for the sheet." "Why the sheet?" "I'm going to cut it into strips so we can bandage your hand. We can keep spares, too." Hector sat on the bed and set about his work, Ellie returning to her previous reclining position behind him. The kitchen scissors were not designed to cut fabric, so it was surprisingly troublesome work for Hector, and the cuts were extremely rough and ragged. It wasn't like beggars could be choosers, though. "You seem to know a lot about this stuff," Ellie said from behind Hector's back. "You knew what medicine to get me, and now you're making bandages. Do you want to be a doctor or something?" "It's nothing like that," Hector replied. "I don't have any real idea what I want to do once I finish school. I've mostly just assumed that after my mandatory service I'll end up working some menial job until I'm old enough to retire. My mom's a nurse. I've just picked up some things from her. You have to wrap burns to protect them from blisters or something like that. My parents are a software engineer and a gardener, but I don't know anything about computers or plants," Ellie said. "You're smarter than you give yourself credit for. I think your talents would be wasted spending your whole life as a cashier." Ordinarily, such praise would have elated Hector, but being reminded of his family, of parents he would almost certainly never see again, diminished the happiness he felt significantly. Instead, he felt a dreary heaviness fall over him. The room fell silent. Then Ellie asked a question he didn't want to answer. "Hey, Hector, do you think your family is okay?" Hector felt a constricting feeling in his throat, like his body was literally trying to choke him with grief. He was always going to have to face this eventually. He didn't want to, but there was no point trying to deny something he already knew. "My brother is fine. He's in a different city. I doubt my parents made it, though. They both work pretty far into the city." "I'm sorry. I thought I told you to stop apologizing." Hector tried to laugh, but it was hollow. "You know, I don't even remember the last things we said to each other in detail, but it was an argument. I wasn't in school because I couldn't deal with it and ran off to hang out with some friends instead." Hector's vision was blurring again, but he refused to let any more tears fall. He had cried enough that day, and he didn't feel like he deserved to grieve with the way he'd left things. He heard the shuffling of a body moving over fabric, and a moment later he felt Ellie's hand cupping his own from behind him. She was shaking again, but he couldn't tell if it was the same as before or out of emotion. Her voice shook slightly as she spoke, as though she too was fighting against tears. "I know exactly how you feel." "Do you?" Hector asked, failing to conceal his disbelief. "I do," Ellie replied. "Before the bomb went off, I had a terrible fight with my parents, too. I ran out of the house and didn't stop running until I couldn't keep going. By the time I came to my senses and went back to try and fix things, they were already gone. The bomb went off maybe half an hour later. I didn't see them again. They would have been right by the explosion. What were the odds they could find solidarity in such a terrible experience? Yet Hector believed everything she said. She spoke with a powerful sincerity that he couldn't ignore. He felt guilty for doubting her, but also a little better. It was oddly comforting knowing Ellie understood his feelings, and he felt relief for finally admitting to his actions. I shouldn't have doubted you, he said eventually. It's fine, Ellie said. It's hard to ignore how unlikely it is we went through such similar things. Sorry I asked you something like that. I thought I told you to stop apologizing, Hector repeated. This time, though, a genuine chuckle did escape him. You're not responsible for any of this. Besides, I actually feel a lot better now that I've said it out loud. You're still keeping up your side of the arrangement. Glad to hear it, Ellie replied. She continued to hold his hand for a while, sharing a moment of support. Hector couldn't help but find himself laughing a little again in spite of himself. I can understand wanting to hold my hand, he said, but it's making it kind of hard to finish cutting this strip. Ellie's hand immediately retracted. Right. Really, though, Hector added. Thanks. He resumed cutting away at the sheet, finishing the last strip he had been working on. Then he turned around on the bed and asked for Ellie's burned hand so he could wrap it. It took him a moment to figure out the best way to go about bandaging the wound. He was pretty sure that his mom had mentioned that burns shouldn't be bandaged too loosely, but it was tricky getting the sweet spot between loose enough not to rub at the damaged skin and tight enough not to fall off. If at any point he made one of the strips too tight, though, Ellie wasn't complaining. A few minutes later, her hand was bandaged. It wasn't the best medical work in history. The strips didn't perfectly cover every spot where there was a burn and were applied rather messily. The worst of it was bound, though. It was the best he could do. There, Hector said. That should do us until we come across someone who can do a better job. It's good enough for me. Ellie flexed her hand and moved it a bit, making sure none of their makeshift bandages came loose. Fortuitously, they all remained in place. Where should we go from here? Hector watched her testing the bandages and thought to himself for a moment. With supplies now secured and Ellie's nausea treated, Hector's plan had essentially been to return to wandering around in search of other survivors. Now that he thought about it, though, he wasn't sure that was the most efficient method. Ellie might have been medicated, but she was clearly unwell and needed to see a doctor. Endlessly walking around just hoping to stumble into other people wasn't helping her get better. As far as Hector knew, it may have made her feel even worse. Still, it wasn't likely they could just walk into the local general practitioner's office. However, it occurred to Hector that perhaps there was a way to get Ellie looked at and find somewhere survivors had gathered. As an added bonus, having a specific destination they were aiming for would just feel better than meandering about and hoping for the best. Well, Hector began, at first I was thinking we'd just wander gradually further out away from the city until we came to an area that's less wrecked. Honestly, though, I don't think that's a great plan anymore. So it would be better for us if we were aiming somewhere specific? Ellie asked. Right, Hector said. I was thinking we should head to a hospital. I'm worried that you've been feeling so sick and you have those burns, too. Plus, I should probably get checked over, too. A hospital is also somewhere where a lot of survivors are likely to come together, so we'd probably be able to find all kinds of help there. Ellie nodded. That makes sense. I don't know where anything is in Coenen, though. Where's the nearest hospital? That was something else Hector had to think about. The hospital he was most familiar with was the one his mother had worked at, which was a short walk away from the central business district. Obviously, that wasn't an option. Memories of a packed waiting room and gray floors started popping into Hector's head. There was one other hospital he was somewhat familiar with. His mom had worked there before moving to the bigger place, and he had spent several hours sitting in that emergency room with a broken leg once. I think the next closest hospital to us is probably St. Christos's, Hector said. At least, as far as I know. It's also in the middle of suburbia for the most part, and it's a concrete building, so it's probably not been hit too badly. Well, the city was never an option, really. This sounds like it's closer, too. Good thinking, Ellie said. It's still a long walk, Hector said. I doubt we'll make it there before tomorrow sometime. Then we should get a move on. Ellie stood up from the bed and picked up the bag, gesturing towards the door with a sweep of her hand. Hector got up himself, then made a point of grabbing the bag from her. She didn't resist, but frowned nonetheless. You can barely walk sometimes. Let's not push our luck, Hector reminded her. Ellie sighed but nodded. Okay, fair enough. Hector headed out of the room and led Ellie back through the house, out the window they had come in through. With a destination in mind, the two of them set off together once more.